So one of my personal perspectives is we all love ACT and we have all these insights in social psych. And my personal perspective is that to get the word out, we need to have to show how our insights actually can inform the big questions in other subfields. So both my presentations are from a macro strat perspective, because this way we show that all these insights we have really can help disentangle some of the big problems they've been stuck with. So this first one is about occupational status. And I'm working with Jesse on this. Okay, I'm gonna just start with what we essentially did, because there's a lot of moving parts in this. So I had to make it sort of streamlined. So essentially what we do in this paper is we use Bayes Act to create a new measure of occupational status based on modeling the likelihood that one occupational actor would defer to another in a matrix of all possible occupations that we have in the dictionary. And even though we use this to model occupational status, occupational prestige, this actually is very generalizable process that you can actually use to show the relative status of anything, actually. So after we develop it, we show that, does it have construct validity? Is it measuring what it claims to measure? Is its dimensionality consistent with the underlying theoretical construct of prestige? And does it predict outcomes that you would theoretically expect it to predict? And we just got our second R&R from ASR on this, so let's hope third time's the charm, that they like our third part. The thing about what I like about this question, it's such an enigma that has plagued us for so long. It's one of our most fundamental concepts going back to Max Weber. And Cecilia Ripley in her presidential address chose status as the issue of inequality, right? Because it transforms resources into group differences. It fuels our assessments of our class location. And it's independent base of power, and this is important in a second, from just material resources, that we're more than just economists, right? That there's something sociological about what we're doing that's unique. Yet, despite how long we've studied it and how important it is, we really just have no good way of measuring it. There's widespread disagreement about how you measure status. For the past 50 years, the predominant method, and still today, if you go into GSS, prestige scores remain the predominant method, right? And essentially, they're based on asking people to rank what is the social standing of a list of occupations. And while that sounds like a great idea, and we keep using it, we've known for a long time that they don't actually work. So even from the 70s, and again, I'm talking from a macro strat perspective. Featherman and Hauser's famously state that these are really just error-prone estimates of material conditions. That essentially they're subjective estimates of education and income. And when we do more studies, we've consistently found what social standing actually is measuring is essentially objective conditions. It's not actually measuring status, which I'm going to talk about a little more. So in the end, prestige scores, interestingly, don't actually measure prestige. They're just a really poor measure of education and income. So what we do is we go back to the beginning. We go back to Weber and say, okay, we have this theoretical construct. How can we create a good measure of that construct? So Weber famously in his class status party said there are three independent but related bases of power. There's economic class, there's social status, and there's political party. And what happens is that status is a specific positive negative estimation of honor. It's a cultural evaluation about how much esteem, worthiness, and value to society, not just how much economic power it has, right? And we know things have status because it'll lead to structured relations of deference, right? Or the opposite, derogation, that you submit to me, right? Knowing that prestige scores were not a very good way, the dominant method that came after this came from organizational economic sociology. And really a lot of the work of Podolny, if you're familiar with it. And for example, when you go in the wine store, there's so many wines, you can't possibly know which one's actually better. So you use status as a proxy for quality. And this is the where this comes from. But borrowing from Weber, they say that status you can know by accumulated acts of deference, right? So if that's the case, then we should be able to conceptualize the status hierarchy by modeling the deference interactions, right? And an example of this was actually done by Burris, where he showed that you'll know which academic departments are higher status because the higher status one, students of high status universities will get hired by the lower status. And he argued that you can know that status by its effect. And this actually also comes from Goffman, who says, status is the symbolic means of a showing appreciation from one to another. Oh yeah, I forgot I got a clicker. Okay. So if we take that idea, then we can use affect control because it can model deference interactions, right? So what we did was we said, okay, we're going to use Bayes' Act to predict which occupational actor will defer to another. And there's actually a EPA for the behavior defer to. Okay, so we know then that, and it's nice talking to ACT people, so I have to explain this, that deflection's inversely proportional to likelihood of an event, right? So I don't have to explain like mothers kissing babies. It's likely, and we know that because it has a low deflection, right? So put within the scope of this study, anything with a high deflection of defer to, we can infer is high status, because they should not defer, right? So if we take a couple interactions, we get a surgeon defers to a coal miner, produces one deflection. If we reverse and we see that the coal miner defers to a surgeon, that's less deflection. So we know that surgeons should not defer to coal miners, right? So if we take this a little further, we do this for all possible combinations, and we create what we call deafness scores. So we take, for example, a nurse, and we model the interaction for all other occupations within the dictionary. Take the mean, and that gives us deafness scores, right? The mean likelihood of deferring to someone else. And in theory, whoever has the highest score should be the least likely to defer, and therefore the highest status. Okay, so to do this, right, we're all familiar with the dictionary, so I don't have to tell you about it. But one aspect of the dictionary people might not be familiar with is when I was Lynn's TA and she asked for suggestions, one thing I said was for us to branch out, we need to do things that the Strat community will accept. So we need to have a representative sample. So this dictionary is unique because I intentionally created a representative sample of occupations. That way you can do stratification studies with it. Because we have a lot of insights, but unless you have a representative sample of occupational meanings, it won't work in their models. So I won't go through this, but essentially I took a lot of care to use occupational codes and classifications that are common in the Strat literature. That way we can do stuff with it. I came up with 304 occupations based on this. So when I talk about modeling this, we can picture a matrix of 300 different occupations all interacting with each other. Okay, so we have this scale, but is it valid? So the first thing we do, first off, we have to find something to compare it to. But since I started off by saying prestige scores aren't valid, we had to find something else. So interestingly, Harris polls actually ask the word prestige. So we use that as our comparison, at least for the beginning part of our construct validity. So if our measure is correct, then it should correlate to what people actually say is prestigious, which is interesting because when we correlate these polls of what's prestigious with prestige polls, they don't correlate at all, which is interesting that over these decades we've been collecting prestige scores. Nobody's actually, that I'm aware of, saw that they don't correlate with when you ask people prestige, right? But what's interesting is our deference scores, I don't know, it cut off my significance, but these are significant, 0, 0, 0, this is not significant. But what's interesting is our deference scores correlate with the Harris scores, which I think is actually quite amazing because we're not actually asking anything about prestige. All we have are equations and sentiments, yet somehow it can derive what people actually say is prestigious. Okay, then the second thing. Theoretically, if Weber, if we're modeling Weber's construct of esteem, it should be primarily evaluation and a little bit of potency, right? Oh, so in order to compare the structure of our different scores and prestige scores, we match them to occupations within the GSS. I'll skip all this. You can read it if you want to, because we're short on time. But essentially what it says is when we regress EPA on deference scores and prestige scores, we see theoretically deference scores work the way they should work. That they're primarily evaluation, where it's capturing the goodness, the esteem, and a little bit of potency, and a little bit of activity. Whereas prestige scores is the opposite. They are essentially acting as a reflection of objective material conditions, right? And that's why you get what you primarily potency. Okay, so then do they actually predict in the way you would expect them to predict? So we chose within the GSS again 5 important subjective workplace outcomes. Is your work important? Are you doing meaningful work? How satisfied are you? Are you attached to your job? Essentially, that one's is if you got rich, would you leave, right? How happy you are, and do you feel respect? And this is important, from a Weberian esteem perspective. I'll skip the details again. You can read all the coding, right? And what we did was we used a series of binary logistic models, and the controls were age, gender, race, education, and income, because we've got to show that it matters in addition to material conditions. And lo and behold, what we find is, yes, on all 5, they're all significant and they all predict positive. So people who are higher status do feel more satisfied at work, do feel happier, do have more important, feel that they are doing important work. And I should say, I didn't show the whole table because that'd be boring. But respect at work was one of the deference scores, one of the strongest predictors of being respected at work. So, all right, so that's what our paper did. I know I glossed over a lot of it, but like everybody said, all week. But essentially what it did was we developed a new measure of occupational prestige going back to Weber and then modeling that. We showed its construct validity, and I should say it's one of the first, I didn't have time to get into the literature, but we think it's one of the first big applications of Bayes-Act, because one thing about occupations is the variance does matter in the status literature. Because if there's a lot of variance, you can get high status interactions if you have a lot of variance in there. And it didn't make a huge difference, because originally we did this paper with, I don't know what we call the old act. We did it with act. And Bayes-Act did improve it some. So it did actually matter. But we did it mainly because at a theoretical level, variance and uncertainty does matter. And I didn't have time to talk about it, but there's also a theoretical contribution about like the dimensions of class versus status. So, all right, that's our paper. I'm Rob. That's there. And then